On December 6, 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency released a statement that sent shockwaves to the global nuclear safety community. The new safe confinement structure at Chernobyl, a massive engineering marvel designed to contain the radioactive remains of destroyed Reactor 4, had lost its primary safety function. The protective shield could no longer prevent the escape of radiation into the environment. This wasn't the result of structural decay or natural deterioration. It was a consequence of deliberate military action in an active war zone. The announcement came nearly 3 years after Russian forces invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and almost 10 months after a devastating drone strike had severely damaged the protective structure in February 2025. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the world's foremost authority on nuclear safety, confirmed that the confinement structure had been compromised to such an extent that it could no longer fulfill its intended purpose. The news was particularly alarming because the new safe confinement wasn't just any protective barrier. It was supposed to be a solution that would last for a century. Completed in 2016 at a cost over 1.5 billion euros, this architectural and engineering achievement was meant to seal away one of humanity's worst nuclear disasters for generations to come. The structure stood 108 meters tall and spanned 257 meters wide, making it one of the largest movable structures ever built by human hands. Yet now, less than a decade after it was put into service, its integrity had been fatally compromised. The implications of this development extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. Chernobyl represents not just a national tragedy, but a global warning about the dangers of nuclear energy when safety protocols fail. The original disaster in 1986 released radioactive materials across Europe, contaminating vast swaths of land and affecting millions of people. The compromised containment structure now threatens to release additional radioactive particles into the atmosphere, though the scale remains uncertain. What makes the situation particularly unprecedented is that it represents the intersection of two modern catastrophes: the legacy of nuclear disaster and the reality of contemporary warfare. Never before has an active war zone encompassed a major nuclear accident site with such significant remaining radioactive material. The international community has watched with growing concern as the situation at Chernobyl has deteriorated. The facility, which sits approximately 130 kilometers north of Kiev, has changed hands multiple times since the beginning of the conflict. Russian forces occupied the site early in the invasion, reportedly using it as a staging ground for military operations. The personnel who maintained the safety systems were forced to work under extreme conditions, often at gunpoint, with limited access to proper equipment and supplies. When Russian forces eventually withdrew from the area, they left behind a facility that had been neglected, potentially damaged, and certainly compromised. The subsequent drone strike in February 2025 appears to have been the final blow that pushed the containment structure beyond its operational limits. What happened at Chernobyl in the spring of 2025 serves as a grim reminder that nuclear safety cannot be guaranteed in conflict zones. The new safe confinement was designed to withstand natural disasters, severe weather, and even minor impacts, but was never intended to survive targeted military strikes. The structure's sophisticated ventilation systems, radiation monitoring equipment, and structural supports have all been compromised to varying degrees. Engineers who designed the system have expressed shock and dismay at seeing their work, which took decades to plan and execute, being destroyed in an instant by weapons of war. The situation represents an inflection point in how the international community thinks about nuclear safety, legacy nuclear sites, and the rules of warfare. As we delve deeper into the story, we'll explore not just what happened, but how we arrived at this dangerous moment and what it means for the future. To understand the gravity of the current crisis, we must first revisit the catastrophic events of April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a late-night safety test. The disaster began just after 1:23 a.m., when a sudden power surge during a planned test led to a catastrophic steam explosion that blew the roof off the reactor building. A second explosion moments later sent a plume of radioactive debris high into the night sky. Unlike the contained meltdowns at 3 Mile Island or Fukushima, the Chernobyl explosion was violent and immediate, exposing the reactor core directly to the atmosphere. Within hours, Fires raged across the facility as graphite moderator blocks burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, continuously pumping radioactive isotopes into the air. The immediate response to the disaster was both heroic and tragically insufficient. Firefighters from a nearby town of Pripyat arrived within minutes, having no idea they were being exposed to lethal doses of radiation. Many of these first responders received doses of 6,000 to 16,000 millisieverts, far beyond what any human can survive. They fought the fires for hours, preventing the disaster from spreading to the adjacent reactors, but paid the ultimate price. Within weeks, 28 of these firefighters and plant workers died from acute radiation syndrome. Soviet authorities initially tried to conceal the scale of the disaster, but when radiation detectors at a nuclear facility in Sweden began registering abnormally high levels 2 days later, the truth could no longer be hidden. The radioactive cloud had traveled over 1,200 kilometers, and within a week, elevated radiation levels were detected across most of Europe. The technical causes of the disaster were rooted in both design flaws and human error. The RBMK 1000 reactor used at Chernobyl had a positive void coefficient, meaning that under certain conditions, a loss of coolant could accelerate rather than slow the nuclear reaction. This design flaw, combined with the decision to disable several safety systems during the test and the operator's incomplete understanding of the reactor's behavior at low power, created a perfect storm of failures. When the reactor began to spiral out of control, the operators tried to activate the emergency shutdown system by inserting control rods. However, a design quirk meant that the control rods actually briefly increased reactivity before dampening it, and in those crucial seconds, the reactor's power output surged to levels hundreds of times higher than normal, triggering the explosions. The environmental and human toll of Chernobyl was staggering. Approximately 350,000 people were eventually evacuated from the surrounding areas, including the entire population of Pripyat, a city of nearly 50,000 that had been built specifically to house Chernobyl workers. The exclusion zone, which initially covered 30 kilometers around the plant, was later expanded to encompass approximately 2,600 square kilometers of contaminated land. Estimates of the long-term death toll vary wildly, from the conservative official count of around 4,000 eventual deaths from radiation-induced cancers to estimates by some organizations of up to 60,000 or more. Thousands of children develop thyroid cancer from exposure to radioactive iodine-131, though most survived thanks to early detection and treatment. Entire ecosystems were devastated, with the red forest, a pine forest near the reactor, turning reddish-brown and dying within days of exposure. The cleanup effort, known as liquidation, involved over 600,000 workers who came to be known as liquidators. These men and women, many of them Soviet military personnel or civilians who were assigned to the task, worked in extremely hazardous conditions to contain the disaster. They cleared radioactive debris from the roof of the adjacent reactors, buried contaminated vehicles and equipment, and constructed the first protective structure, the object shelter, better known as a sarcophagus. Completed in November 1986, just 7 months after the disaster, this hastily built concrete and steel structure was never intended as a permanent solution. It was riddled with cracks and gaps, and engineers knew from the beginning that it would eventually need to be replaced. The liquidators who built it worked in shifts measured in seconds or minutes, whatever time they could endure before reaching dangerous radiation exposure limits. Their sacrifice prevented an even worse catastrophe, but many paid with their health or lives. The legacy of that disaster, and the heroism of those who contained it, forms the essential backdrop to understanding why the current breach of containment is so alarming. By the early 2000s, it was clear that the original sarcophagus built hastily in 1986 was failing. Radiation was leaking through cracks, and structural engineers warned that the entire edifice could collapse, potentially releasing vast quantities of radioactive dust. The structure had been built under extreme duress, with workers exposed to dangerous radiation levels, and many of its structural elements were inadequately secured. Rain and snow infiltrated the shelter, accelerating corrosion and creating pools of contaminated water. In 2003, a partial collapse of one section sent a cloud of radioactive dust into the air, fortunately contained within the outer structure. It was a stark warning that time was running out. The international community recognized that a new, more robust solution was desperately needed, not just to contain the existing radioactive material, but to allow for the eventual dismantlement of the ruined reactor and the original sarcophagus itself. The solution came in the form of an unprecedented international collaboration. In 1997, the G7 nations established the Chernobyl Shelter Fund, which eventually raised over 1.5 billion euros from more than 40 countries. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development managed the fund, and in 2007, a consortium of French construction giant Vinci and the Bouygues Group won the contract to design and build what will become known as the new Safe Confinement. The design specifications were extraordinary. The structure would need to contain the reactor for at least 100 years, withstand temperatures ranging from -43 to +45 degrees Celsius, survive extreme winds and potential tornadoes, and resist seismic activity. It would also need to prevent any radioactive material from escaping while allowing workers inside to eventually begin the dangerous work of dismantling the old sarcophagus and removing the most hazardous materials. The engineering challenges were immense. Constructing the new Safe Confinement directly over the reactor would expose workers to dangerous radiation levels. So engineers devised an ingenious solution. They would build it nearby and slide it into place. The structure was erected 300 meters away from Reactor 4, assembled in two massive arch sections. Each half weighed approximately 15,000 tons and stood as tall as a 30-story building. The arch design was chosen because it could span the entire reactor building without requiring internal supports, creating a vast cathedral-like space underneath. The structure's exterior was clad in layers of steel and reinforced with a sophisticated network of trusses and beams. Inside, two enormous crane systems were installed, capable of lifting 50 tons each, which would eventually be used to dismantle the old sarcophagus piece by piece. Construction began in earnest in 2010 and took 6 years to complete. Workers faced constant challenges, from the technical complexity of building such a massive structure to the ever-present radiation hazard. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every worker's movement had to be carefully planned to minimize exposure. The site was divided into zones based on radiation levels, with the most contaminated areas accessible only for brief periods with full protective equipment. Weather conditions in northern Ukraine posed additional challenges. Bitter winters and scorching summers tested both materials and workers. Financial challenges also emerged, with costs rising as the complexity of the project became fully apparent. Additional international funding had to be secured multiple times to keep the project on track. In November 2016, a historic moment arrived. Using a sophisticated system of hydraulic jacks and rail tracks, the new Safe Confinement was slowly moved into position over the destroyed reactor. The operation took several days, with engineers monitoring thousands of sensors to ensure everything proceeded safely. When the structure finally settled into its permanent location, it marked the completion of one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history. The new Safe Confinement wasn't just a passive barrier. It was a sophisticated system incorporating ventilation to prevent the buildup of radioactive gases, monitoring equipment to track radiation levels and structural integrity, and the infrastructure needed for the eventual decommissioning work. At the dedication ceremony, international officials celebrated not just an engineering triumph, but a symbol of global cooperation in the face of a shared threat. Nobody present that day could have imagined that less than a decade later, this marvel of modern engineering would become collateral damage in a devastating war. Even after completion of the new Safe Confinement, the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone remained one of the most unusual places on Earth. Covering approximately 2,600 square kilometers around the destroyed reactor, the zone had transformed from a scene of apocalyptic devastation into something altogether stranger, a landscape where nature and radiation coexisted in an eerie equilibrium. The city of Pripyat, once home to 50,000 people, stood frozen in time, its apartment blocks, schools, and amusement parks slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. Trees grew through building roofs, moss-covered Soviet-era murals, and wildlife roamed streets where children once played. The famous Ferris wheel, painted in cheerful yellow, never carried passengers. The park was scheduled to open on May 1st, 1986, just days after the disaster made such celebrations impossible. Despite the radiation, life found a way to persist and even thrive in the exclusion zone. With humans largely absent, wildlife populations exploded in a phenomenon scientists found both fascinating and troubling. Wolves, wild boar, deer, lynx, and even brown bears returned to areas where they hadn't been seen in decades. Bird populations flourished, including rare species like the white-tailed eagle and black stork. The Przewalski's horse, an endangered species, was deliberately introduced and established a breeding population. Studies of these animals revealed complex patterns. While they accumulated radioactive isotopes in their bodies, populations as a whole seemed robust. However, individual animals showed elevated rates of mutations, and debate continued among scientists about whether this represented a genuine recovery or merely masked ongoing genetic damage that would manifest over generations. Before 2022, the exclusion zone had also become an unlikely tourist destination. Carefully controlled tours brought thousands of visitors each year to witness the haunting beauty and sobering lessons of Pripyat and the reactor site. Tourists walked through abandoned apartment buildings, visited the rusting amusement park, and stood before the new Safe Confinement, while guides explained the disaster's history and the ongoing work to make the site safe. These tours operated under strict protocols. Visitors were monitored with dosimeters, prohibited from touching anything or venturing off designated paths, and thoroughly scanned for radiation before leaving. For most tourists, the dose received during a one-day visit was less than a transatlantic flight, though hotspots of intense radiation remained scattered throughout the zone, marked with warning signs and cordoned off. Maintaining the new Safe Confinement and monitoring the exclusion zone required a dedicated workforce of several thousand people who commuted in daily from a nearby city of Slavutic. These workers included engineers monitoring confinement structure systems, radiation safety specialists conducting continuous surveys of contamination levels, security personnel guarding against unauthorized entry, and researchers studying everything from structural integrity to wildlife populations. The work was well paid by Ukrainian standards, reflecting both the specialized skills required and the inherent risks. The Ukrainian government had established a comprehensive program to monitor workers' health, track their radiation exposure, and provide medical care when needed. Despite the radiation, many workers expressed pride in their roles, viewing themselves as guardians of a site that represented both tragedy and resilience. The international scientific community maintained a significant presence in the exclusion zone as well. Research stations studied everything from radiation's effects on ecosystems to the behavior of radioactive materials in different environmental conditions. Projects were underway to develop new decontamination techniques, study the structural integrity of aging Soviet-era buildings, and understand how radiation moved through soil and water systems. The zone had become, paradoxically, one of the world's most important field laboratories for studying radiation ecology and the long-term effects of nuclear contamination. Data gathered their informed safety protocols at nuclear facilities worldwide and shaped understanding of how ecosystems recover or fail to recover from catastrophic contamination. All of this careful work, decades of accumulated knowledge and infrastructure, will be thrown into chaos when Russian forces rolled across the border in February 2022, and the exclusion zone became, for the first time, not just a monument of past disaster, but the scene of active warfare. On February 24th, 2022, the first day of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Chernobyl became an immediate strategic objective. Russian forces approaching Kiev from Belarus crossed into the exclusion zone and seized control of the nuclear facility within hours. The route through Chernobyl offered one of the shortest paths to the Ukrainian capital, and Russian commanders apparently calculated that Ukrainian forces would be reluctant to engage in heavy combat near the destroyed reactor. Ukrainian staff at the facility, numbering around 200 workers who had reported for their regular shifts that morning, suddenly found themselves hostages in their own workplace. Russian soldiers occupied the control rooms, administrative buildings, and critical infrastructure, transforming the site from a carefully managed decommissioning project into an active military position. The conditions under which the Ukrainian staff were forced to work during the occupation bordered on the catastrophic. Reports emerged that workers were compelled to maintain the facility's critical systems for days or even weeks without relief. Normal shift rotations, which carefully limited radiation exposure, were abandoned, Workers couldn't leave even as their personal dosimeters registered accumulating doses that exceeded safe limits. Food supplies dwindled, exhaustion set in, and the stress of working at gunpoint, combined with fear for their families outside the exclusion zone, created almost unbearable conditions. Some workers later reported that Russian soldiers seemed unaware of or indifferent to radiation risks, with troops digging trenches in areas known to be highly contaminated and stirring up radioactive dust that had been safely settled for decades. One of the most concerning developments during the Russian occupation was the reported damage to radiation monitoring systems. The Chernobyl site has an extensive network of sensors that continuously monitor radiation levels throughout the facility and the surrounding exclusion zone. These systems provide early warning of any increase in radioactivity that might indicate a problem with the containment structures or other issues. During the occupation, international monitoring agencies reported losing connectivity with these systems. Whether the disconnection was deliberate sabotage, collateral damage from combat operations, or simply the result of power interruptions remains unclear. What is certain is that for weeks, the international community had no reliable data about radiation levels at one of the world's most dangerous nuclear sites. The threat of a radiation release during the occupation was very real. Heavy military vehicles churned up contaminated soil, potentially releasing radioactive particles into the air. Power supplies to the facility were intermittently disrupted, raising concerns about the systems that maintain the new safe confinement and monitor conditions inside the structure. The spent fuel storage facilities, containing radioactive material from the plant's other reactors, also required constant monitoring and active cooling systems. If these systems fail for an extended period, the consequences could be severe. International agencies, including the IAEA, issued urgent appeals for the site to be demilitarized, warning that military operations near Chernobyl created unacceptable risks not just for Ukraine, but for all of Europe. When Russian forces withdrew from the Chernobyl area in late March 2022, they left behind a site in unknown condition. Initial assessments by returning Ukrainian staff revealed widespread disruption. Equipment had been damaged or looted. Security systems were compromised, and areas of the facility showed signs of hasty fortification and military occupation. Most critically, the long-term effects of the occupation on the containment structures couldn't be immediately assessed. The new safe confinement appeared intact, but its sophisticated monitoring systems had been disrupted, making it difficult to be certain. In the months that followed, Ukrainian engineers worked to restore systems and assess damage, but the facility had lost a protective status that had shielded it for 36 years. Chernobyl was now unmistakably part of an active war zone, and the worst consequences of that new reality were yet to come. Nearly 3 years after the initial occupation, the new safe confinement suffered its most devastating blow. In February 2025, the protective structure was struck by a drone in what appears to have been a deliberate attack, though the exact circumstances and responsibility remain subjects of intense controversy. According to reports from Greenpeace and other monitoring organizations, approximately 50% of the northern roof structure of the new safe confinement sustained significant damage in the strike. The explosion tore through layers of protective steel and compromised structural elements that were essential to confinement's integrity. Given the structure's design, which relied on the intact arch maintaining its shape and stability, damage to even one section potentially compromised the entire system's ability to contain radiation. The immediate aftermath of the strike was chaotic and frightening. Ukrainian authorities struggled to assess the damage while the facility remained within range of further attacks. International monitoring agencies demanded access and information, but the ongoing conflict made rapid assessment difficult. Initial reports indicated that radiation levels in the immediate vicinity of the damaged confinement had increased, though by how much and whether radioactive materials were being released into the wider environment remained unclear. The sophisticated ventilation system designed to prevent the buildup and release of radioactive gases had been compromised, raising concerns that the structure could no longer maintain the negative air pressure that prevented contamination from escaping. What made the strike particularly alarming was the apparent targeting of critical infrastructure. The new safe confinement is clearly identifiable from aerial reconnaissance. Its massive arch is unlike anything else in the region. If the strike was deliberate, It represented an unprecedented escalation in the targeting of nuclear safety infrastructure. If it was accidental or collateral damage, it demonstrated the horrifying risks of conducting military operations anywhere near legacy nuclear sites. Either scenario pointed to an urgent need for international intervention. But with Ukraine and Russia locked in ongoing conflict, diplomatic solutions remained elusive. The United Nations and IAEA issued stern warnings about the consequences of further damage to the site, but lacked the power to enforce protection of the facility. Engineers familiar with the new Safe Confinement's design immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. The structure was designed with redundancy in mind, multiple systems performing the same functions, so that failures could be tolerated. However, the extent of damage to the northern roof section suggested that multiple redundant systems had been compromised simultaneously. The structural integrity of the arch itself was potentially at risk. If the damaged section continued to deteriorate, or if additional strikes occurred, the entire structure could face catastrophic failure. Unlike the gradual decay of the original sarcophagus, which took decades and could be monitored and mitigated, damage from military action could rapidly render the entire containment system ineffective. In the months following the February 2025 strike, Ukrainian authorities attempted to conduct repair work, but the security situation made sustained efforts nearly impossible. Workers could not safely access the most damaged areas, and bringing in the specialized equipment needed for repairs while the site remained a potential target was deemed too dangerous. International offers of assistance face logistical and security barriers. The window for preventing further deterioration was closing rapidly, and with each passing month, the likelihood of the containment structure fulfilling its intended 100-year lifespan diminished. By December 2025, when the IAEA finally confirmed that the structure had lost its primary containment function, it merely formalized what many experts had feared since the February strike: that one of humanity's most impressive engineering achievements, designed to protect future generations from the mistakes of the past, had become yet another casualty of war. On December 6, 2025, the International Atomic Energy Agency released a statement that confirmed the international community's worst fears. After months of assessment and monitoring, the IAEA formally announced that the new safe confinement structure at Chernobyl had lost its key safety functions, including the ability to prevent the release of radioactive material into the environment. The announcement was worded carefully, using technical language that understated the significance, but nuclear safety experts immediately recognized its gravity. The structure was no longer functioning as intended. The containment of Reactor 4's radioactive remains, the primary purpose for which €1.5 billion had been spent and years of international effort invested, was no longer assured. The IAEA's statement detailed multiple system failures within the containment structure. The ventilation system, which was designed to maintain negative air pressure inside the structure and prevent radioactive gases from escaping, had been compromised. Radiation monitoring equipment that provided continuous data about conditions inside and around confinement was either damaged or providing unreliable readings. Structural integrity concerns raise the possibility that further deterioration could occur without immediate intervention. Most alarmingly, the agency confirmed that radioactive material was no longer being completely contained. Though the statement was vague about whether this meant ongoing releases into the environment or merely the potential for such releases under certain conditions. International reaction to the IAEA announcement was swift and alarmed. European nations downwind from Chernobyl, particularly Poland, Belarus, and the Baltic states, expressed grave concern and demanded more detailed information about potential radiation releases. Several countries enhanced their radiation monitoring networks, deploying additional sensors to detect any increases in atmospheric radioactivity. Environmental organizations issued warnings and called for immediate international action to secure the site. The European Union pledged financial and technical support for emergency repairs, but acknowledged that such work could not be safely conducted while the security situation remained volatile. NATO members carefully avoided directly blaming either Ukraine or Russia for the damage, focusing instead on the imperative need to protect the site from further harm. The scientific community responded to the news with a mixture of dismay and I told you so frustration. Nuclear safety experts have been warning since the beginning of the conflict that Chernobyl and Ukraine's active nuclear power plants represented unacceptable risks in a war zone. The new Safe Confinement's failure validated those warnings in the worst possible way. Researchers pointed out that the structure had been designed to withstand natural disasters and gradual degradation, but never direct military attack. Some engineers involved in the original design and construction expressed anguish that their life's work had been damaged, perhaps irreparably, by a conflict they felt powerless to stop. Papers and reports flooded scientific journals calling for new international protocols to protect nuclear sites during armed conflicts, though critics noted that such protocols would be meaningless without enforcement mechanisms that did not currently exist. What the IAEA did not include in its December 2025 announcement may have been as significant as what it did say. The statement provided no specific data on how much radioactive material might be escaping or where it might be dispersing. There was no timeline for when repairs might be possible or how much such repairs would cost. Most critically, there was no acknowledgement of who bore responsibility for the damage or how the international community might prevent further degradation of the site. These omissions reflected the impossible position the IAEA found itself in as a technical agency. It could assess and report on nuclear safety issues, but it had no authority to prevent military operations or compel combatants to protect nuclear facilities. The announcement was simultaneously a vital warning and an admission of the international community's helplessness in the face of a crisis that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier, but was now terrifyingly real. To truly understand why the breach in new Safe Confinement is so dangerous, we need to explore what lies beneath that massive arch, a radioactive nightmare that represents one of the most hazardous environments ever created by human activity. When Reactor 4 exploded in 1986, approximately 190 tons of uranium dioxide fuel and other reactor materials were ejected from the core or melted down inside the reactor building. Much of this material formed what's known as corium, a lava-like mixture of molten nuclear fuel, reactor components, and building materials that flowed through the reactor building like radioactive magma. The most famous formation is called the Elephant's Foot, a mass of corium discovered in a basement corridor that was so intensely radioactive that anyone who stood next to it in 1986 would have received a lethal dose in less than 2 minutes. The destroyed reactor building is a multi-story structure filled with incredibly dangerous materials in various forms. Some areas contain relatively intact but highly radioactive fuel assemblies. Others are covered in radioactive dust, pulverized fuel, and reactor components that settled on every surface. The corium formations, which harden as they cooled, contain some of the most radioactive materials on Earth, with isotopes including plutonium-239 americium-241 cesium-137 and strontium-90. These materials have half-lives ranging from decades to thousands of years, meaning they will remain hazardous for unimaginable stretches of time. The total inventory of radioactive materials still within the structure is estimated at approximately 200 tons of nuclear fuel and related materials, though exact quantities are impossible to determine given the extreme radiation levels that prevent detailed surveys. The original sarcophagus, hastily constructed in 1986, sit inside the new Safe Confinement like a toxic Matryoshka doll. This older structure was never meant to be permanent and has significant gaps and weaknesses through which radioactive dust can escape. Rain and snowmelt infiltrate the sarcophagus, creating pools of contaminated water that slowly corrode the structure's supports and potentially mobilize radioactive materials, allowing them to move in ways that are difficult to predict or control. The space between the old sarcophagus and the new confinement structure is vast, designed to allow eventual dismantlement work, but also means that a breach in the outer structure doesn't immediately release radioactive material from the reactor itself. Instead, it compromises a controlled environment that was supposed to be maintained for safe decommissioning work. What makes the situation particularly complex is that the radioactive materials inside are not stable. Nuclear fission is still occurring within some of the corium masses, albeit at very low rates, a phenomenon known as subcritical fission. This generates heat and radiation, and under certain circumstances, particularly if water infiltrates the masses in specific ways, fission rates could increase. While an actual nuclear explosion is impossible, the fuel is no longer configured in a way that could sustain the chain reaction needed, the risk of what's called a criticality event exists. Such an event would release bursts of radiation and heat, potentially dispersing radioactive material and making the area even more dangerous. Engineers and scientists carefully monitor for any signs that criticality might be developing, but with monitoring systems now compromised, this surveillance has become much more difficult. The decommissioning plan that the new Safe Confinement was designed to enable involved decades of careful work. Robotic systems and remote-controlled equipment would gradually dismantle the old sarcophagus, remove the most dangerous radioactive materials, and eventually stabilize the site to a point where it no longer posed an immediate threat. This was expected to take until at least 2065, possibly longer, and cost billions of additional euros. Every step would need to be carefully planned and executed to avoid disturbing the radioactive materials in ways that might cause releases or criticality events. Now, with the containment structure compromised, this entire carefully orchestrated plan is in jeopardy. The materials inside haven't changed. They remain exactly as dangerous as they were, but the protective barrier that was supposed to allow safe decommissioning work is failing, potentially leaving these materials exposed to the elements and at risk of dispersal for decades or centuries to come. One of the most difficult aspects of the current Chernobyl crisis is assessing the actual radiation risk to human populations and the environment. Radiation is invisible, odorless, and imperceptible to human senses, which makes it particularly frightening. People can't tell if they're being exposed without specialized equipment. The current situation is further complicated by incomplete information, damaged monitoring systems, and the general chaos of a war zone. What we do know is that the new Safe Confinement's failure means that radioactive materials that were previously contained now have pathways to escape into the environment. But the devil, as always, is in the details, and those details remain frustratingly unclear. Radiation from nuclear materials comes in several forms, each with different characteristics and hazards. Alpha particles are relatively large and can't penetrate skin, but are extremely dangerous if inhaled or ingested. Beta particles can penetrate skin but are stopped by clothing or thin barriers. Gamma rays are pure energy and can pass through the human body, requiring dense shielding like lead or concrete to block. Neutron radiation, produced during active fission, is also penetrating and particularly damaging. The materials inside the destroyed reactor emit all these forms of radiation, and the specific hazard depends on which isotopes are released and how people are exposed. Radioactive dust particles, if dispersed by wind, could be inhaled by people hundreds of kilometers away, delivering alpha and beta radiation directly to lung tissue, where they could cause cancer years or decades later. Current radiation levels in the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone vary enormously depending on location. Some areas, particularly those that were thoroughly decontaminated, have radiation levels only slightly above normal background. Other hotspots, where radioactive materials accumulated, remain intensely dangerous. Before the containment failure, radiation near the new Safe Confinement structure itself was relatively moderate, not safe for prolonged exposure, but manageable for workers with proper protection and time limits. The concern now is that with the containment compromised, radiation levels could increase unpredictably. Strong winds, rain, or structural deterioration could mobilize radioactive dust and spread across wider areas, both within the exclusion zone and potentially beyond. The experience of previous nuclear incidents provides some context for what might happen, though each situation is unique. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster released approximately 5% of the reactor core into the environment, an enormous quantity that contaminated vast areas. The current situation is unlikely to approach that scale, as the remaining radioactive material is not being propelled high into the atmosphere by explosion and fire. Instead, the risk is of gradual release through damaged areas of the containment structure, dispersal of radioactive dust by wind, or contamination of groundwater if rainwater carries radioactive material deeper into the soil. These processes would affect smaller areas less dramatically, but could still create serious health risks for people living nearby and complicate cleanup efforts. Environmental monitoring will be crucial in the months and years ahead. Radiation sensors across Ukraine and neighboring countries will track any increases in airborne radioactivity. Soil and water samples will be analyzed for radioactive contamination, Agricultural products from areas potentially affected will need enhanced testing. One of the lasting legacies of Chernobyl has been the need to monitor food supplies for radioactive cesium and strontium that plants absorb from contaminated soil. The World Health Organization, European environmental agencies, and Ukrainian authorities will need to coordinate comprehensive monitoring efforts to detect any radiation releases early and respond appropriately. The challenge is that in the midst of an ongoing war, resources for such monitoring are limited, access to affected areas may be restricted, and the political will to acknowledge problems that might cause panic is often lacking. The truth about the current radiation risk may only become clear months or years from now when comprehensive data can finally be gathered and analyzed. The failure of the new Safe Confinement has created a diplomatic crisis that extends far beyond Ukraine and Russia. Nuclear safety has been recognized as a global concern since the 1950s, and the international framework governing nuclear materials and facilities is built on the premise that nations will maintain safety standards regardless of other conflicts. The damage to Chernobyl represents a catastrophic failure of that framework and raises existential questions about how to protect nuclear sites in an era where armed conflicts increasingly involve nations with nuclear facilities, weapons, or legacy contamination issues. The international community's response has been characterized by urgent statements, pled support, and underlying frustration at the lack of mechanisms to actually protect the site or prevent further damage. The European Union has been particularly vocal in its concern, given that prevailing winds could carry any radiation releases across EU territory. European Commission officials have demanded transparency about the extent of the damage and any radiation releases, while pledging financial and technical assistance for repairs once security conditions permit. However, the EU's response has been hampered by divisions among member states about how to pressure Russia without escalating the broader conflict or endangering European energy supplies, though the latter concern has diminished since the early months of the war. Poland and the Baltic states, closest to Chernobyl and traditionally most concerned about Russian aggression, have pushed for stronger action, including proposals for a NATO or UN mission to secure the Chernobyl site, though such ideas have gained little traction given the obvious impossibility of deploying international forces into an active war zone. The United States has approached the crisis through both diplomatic and technical channels. The U.S. Department of Energy, which has extensive expertise in nuclear decommissioning from its own Cold War legacy sites, has offered technical consultation and assistance. American radiation monitoring assets, including satellites and ground-based sensor networks, have been quietly tasked with gathering data about radiation levels around Chernobyl to verify Ukrainian and IAEA reports. Diplomatically, U.S. officials have used the Chernobyl situation to build international pressure on Russia, framing the damage to the containment structure as evidence of reckless disregard for international norms and safety. However, this messaging has been complicated by questions about exactly what happened. If the damage was caused by a Ukrainian drone targeting Russian forces near Chernobyl, the narrative becomes far more complex. Russia's response to the crisis has been characterized by denial, deflection, and counter-accusations. Russian officials have suggested that any damage to the containment structure was caused by Ukrainian attacks, while downplaying the significance of the IAEA's announcements. Russian media has accused Ukraine of deliberately sabotaging nuclear safety as a false flag operation to generate international sympathy and support. These narratives, regardless of their relationship to facts, have found audiences both domestically and internationally among those skeptical of Western media reports about the conflict. Russia has also blocked attempts at the UN Security Council to establish international monitoring or protection of the Chernobyl site, arguing that such measures would infringe on sovereignty and might be used as cover for intelligence gathering or military positioning. Perhaps the most significant diplomatic consequence of the Chernobyl crisis has been renewed attention to the vulnerability of nuclear facilities during armed conflict. Ukraine has 15 operational nuclear reactors at 4 power plant sites, all of which have been affected by the war to varying degrees. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest, has been occupied by Russian forces since early in the conflict, with Ukrainian staff operating under similar duress to what Chernobyl workers experienced. The International Atomic Energy Agency has attempted to establish permanent monitoring missions at Ukrainian nuclear sites, with mixed success. The Chernobyl containment failure has given urgency to proposals for strengthening international law regarding nuclear facilities during wartime. But as with so many aspects of international law, enforcement mechanisms remain the fundamental problem. Nations at war have historically shown limited concern for international legal niceties, and nuclear sites, for all their inherent dangers, may become targets or collateral damage when military objectives dictate. The international community's inability to prevent or effectively respond to the Chernobyl crisis exposes the limits of global governance in matters where national sovereignty and military necessity clash with collective safety interests. While the immediate radiation release from the compromised new safe confinement appears to be limited, the human cost of this crisis extends far beyond direct exposure risks. The workers who maintained Chernobyl and the new safe confinement before the war were part of a community with specialized skills and deep commitment to nuclear safety. Many had spent their entire careers at the site, managing the complex systems that kept the destroyed reactor contained while working toward the ultimate goal of full decommissioning. The war has shattered this community, scattering workers, destroying decades of accumulated expertise, and making the continuation of their life's work nearly impossible. During the Russian occupation of Chernobyl in early 2022, approximately 200 workers were held at the facility under conditions that violated every principle of nuclear safety. These men and women were forced to maintain critical systems while receiving far higher radiation doses than any safety protocol would allow, without adequate rest, food, or medical care. Some workers later reported accumulated doses over their time working at the site that far exceeded annual limits, doses received in weeks rather than years. While acute radiation syndrome was apparently avoided, these exposures increased lifetime cancer risks significantly. Many of these workers have since left the field entirely, traumatized by their experience and unwilling to return to Chernobyl even as security conditions improved. Their departure represents an enormous loss of institutional knowledge that will be nearly impossible to replace. The nearby city of Slavutic, built after the 1986 disaster specifically to house Chernobyl workers and their families, has been deeply affected by the ongoing crisis. With approximately 25,000 residents, Slavutica's economy and identity were entirely built around servicing the Chernobyl site. Workers commuted daily via special train to the facility, maintained exclusion zone, and worked on decommissioning projects. The war has devastated this economy and community. Some residents have fled as the area has become a conflict zone. Others remain out of attachment to their homes or lack of alternatives, living with the uncertainty of what future there can be for a city whose entire purpose has been compromised. The psychological toll is immense. Residents survived and built lives around managing the legacy of one disaster, only to find themselves caught in another. The broader populations of northern Ukraine and southern Belarus who live near but outside the exclusion zone face renewed fears about radiation exposure. These communities have lived with elevated background radiation for nearly 40 years, following restrictions on which foods they can grow and which areas they can use, adapting to a contaminated landscape while maintaining as much normality as possible. The news that the containment structure has failed brings back memories of 1986 and fears that contamination might spread further, rendering additional land uninhabitable or unsafe for agriculture. Agricultural communities already devastated by war now wonder if their fields might face additional contamination, destroying what little livelihood remains. These fears are compounded by lack of reliable information. In a war zone with compromised monitoring systems, residents often don't know whether their health is at risk. The long-term health impact of containment failure won't be fully understood for decades. Radiation-induced cancers typically appear 10, 20, or even 30 years after exposure. If radioactive materials have been released from the compromised structure, epidemiologists will eventually need to conduct studies tracking cancer rates in potentially exposed populations, attempting to separate any increases caused by Chernobyl radiation from the myriad other factors that influence cancer incidence. Such studies are complex, expensive, and often controversial. The debate over how many cancer deaths were caused by the original 1986 disaster continues to this day, with estimates varying by orders of magnitude depending on methodology and assumptions. What is certain is that the workers who maintained Chernobyl under occupation the community surrounding the site, and potentially populations across wider areas of Ukraine and Belarus will live with uncertainty about their health for the rest of their lives, a psychological burden that may ultimately prove as damaging as any physical exposure to radiation. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone had become an accidental nature reserve, a testament to nature's resilience even in the face of catastrophic contamination. Wildlife thrived in the absence of human activity, creating ecosystems that were both radiologically contaminated and biologically robust. The compromise of the new Safe Confinement threatens this delicate balance and raises profound questions about the environmental consequences of renewed radioactive material releases. Unlike human populations, which can be evacuated, and infrastructure, which can be decontaminated or rebuilt, ecosystems must endure whatever contamination occurs, with effects rippling through food chains and persisting across generations of organisms. The immediate environmental risk centers on the potential mobilization of radioactive dust from inside the damaged containment structure. Strong winds, particularly during dry periods, could carry this dust across the exclusion zone and beyond, recontaminating areas that had seen gradual improvement over decades. Radioactive particles would settle on soil, vegetation, and water bodies, becoming available for uptake by plants and animals. This would restart contamination cycles that had been slowly declining as shorter-lived isotopes decayed and longer-lived ones became bound up in soil or plant material in ways that made them less bioavailable. Species that had adapted to current radiation levels might face new challenges if contamination increases significantly. Water contamination represents another serious environmental concern. The Pripyat River flows past Chernobyl before joining the Dnieper River, which eventually flows into the Black Sea. Rainfall infiltrating the damaged containment structure could carry radioactive materials into groundwater or surface runoff, which could then enter these water systems. While dilution would reduce concentration substantially, certain radioactive isotopes like strontium 90 behave chemically similar to calcium and can accumulate in aquatic organisms and ultimately in humans and animals that consume them. The Dnieper River provides water for millions of people downstream, including the capital city of Kyiv. While catastrophic contamination seems unlikely, any increase in radioactive material in these water systems will require enhanced monitoring and potentially treatment of drinking water supplies, costly measures for a nation already devastated by war. The psychological and cultural impact on how humans interact with the environment around Chernobyl has also been profound. Before the war, the exclusion zone represented a kind of hopeful narrative. Yes, a terrible disaster occurred, but nature recovered, and through careful management and impressive engineering, humans were making the site progressively safer. The compromise of the containment structure has shattered that narrative. Now the exclusion zone again represents danger, uncertainty, and human failure. This shift affects not just local attitudes, but global perceptions about whether nuclear contamination can truly be managed over the long term. If a structure designed to last 100 years fails in less than 10, what confidence can anyone have in long-term radioactive waste storage solutions that need to function for tens of thousands of years? Climate change adds another layer of complexity to the environmental consequences of containment failure. Climate models predict that Ukraine will experience more extreme weather events in coming decades, more intense rainfall, more severe droughts, higher temperatures, and stronger storms. Each of these factors could exacerbate the mobilization and spread of radioactive materials from the compromised containment structure. Droughts could expose contaminated sediments in water bodies and make radioactive dust more susceptible to wind dispersal. Intense rainfall could increase infiltration into the structure and contaminated soil, mobilizing radioactive materials into water systems. Stronger storms could directly damage the already compromised containment structure further. The intersection of nuclear contamination and climate change at Chernobyl represents a preview of challenges that might face other contaminated sites worldwide as the climate continues to change, raising unsettling questions about the long-term viability of containment strategies that were designed assuming relatively stable environmental conditions. Repairing the new Safe Confinement represents an engineering challenge of staggering complexity, made nearly impossible by the ongoing conflict and severe damage to the structure. Engineers familiar with the confinement's design emphasize that it was never intended to be easily repaired if significantly damaged, The structure was meant to remain intact for a century, making repair provisions secondary to initial robustness. The massive arch, weighing over 30,000 tons and standing 108 meters tall, was designed as an integrated system where structural elements, ventilation, monitoring equipment, and containment functions all work together. Damage to one part potentially compromises the entire system in ways that aren't immediately obvious and may be extremely difficult to remedy. The northern roof section, where approximately 50% of the structure was damaged in the February 2025 drone strike, is particularly critical. This section contains not just structural steel, but also sophisticated ventilation systems that maintain negative air pressure inside the confinement, preventing radioactive gases and dust from escaping. Repairing this damage would require access from the outside, working at heights over 100 meters in a radioactive environment, or from inside, which would mean working in close proximity to the damaged sections while exposed to radiation from the reactor below. Either approach presents enormous risks and would require specialized equipment, extensive safety protocols, and months or years of work even under ideal conditions. Current conditions are anything but ideal. The economic cost of repairs, should they become feasible, would likely run into hundreds of millions of euros. The original structure cost approximately 1.5 billion euros, and while repairs wouldn't approach that scale, the specialized nature of the work, extreme safety requirements, and need for custom materials and equipment would make this one of the most expensive repair projects imaginable. Multiple countries and international organizations have pledged financial support, but pledges and actual funding are different matters. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which managed the original construction fund, would likely need to establish a new facility specifically for repairs, requiring diplomatic negotiations and financial commitments that could take years to finalize, time that the deteriorating structure may not have. Beyond physical repairs, the damaged monitoring and control systems must be restored or replaced. The new Safe Confinement incorporated hundreds of sensors that continuously monitor radiation levels, structural integrity, air pressure, temperature, humidity, and other critical parameters. These systems provided early warning of any problems and allowed engineers to understand conditions inside the structure. Many of these sensors were damaged in the strike or failed due to subsequent neglect and lack of maintenance. Replacing them would require either accessing the interior of the structure or installing new external monitoring systems, both challenging propositions. Without reliable monitoring data, engineers cannot be certain about current conditions inside the confinement or track whether repairs are actually effective. Some engineers have suggested that if repairs to the new Safe Confinement prove impossible or inadequate, an entirely new containment structure might eventually be necessary. This possibility is almost too daunting to contemplate. It would essentially mean repeating the entire project that was just completed, but under even more challenging conditions, as the existing damaged structure would complicate any new construction. When news broke that the new Safe Confinement at Chernobyl had lost its key safety functions, the shock was not limited to Ukraine or even Europe. It rippled through every country that operates nuclear power plants or stores large amounts of radioactive waste. For decades, Chernobyl had been presented as a closed chapter. The disaster in 1986 was a nightmare, and the Great Steel Arch completed in 2016 was the closure. The failure of that arch, not due to age or engineering miscalculation, but to war, shattered this comfortable narrative. It forced governments, engineers, and international agencies to confront a hard truth. Nuclear safety has been built on the assumption of peace, yet the world is anything but peaceful. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, safety regulations and plant designs have been framed around scenarios like equipment failure, operator error, earthquakes, floods, and occasional industrial accidents. These are terrible, but they are also statistically predictable and politically neutral. Armed conflict is different. It is intentional, chaotic, and unconstrained. No reactor containment dome, no spent fuel pool, no waste repository was ever designed to withstand sustained artillery fire, precision drone strikes, or being used as a shield by an occupying army. Chernobyl's damage shield proves that if a nuclear site becomes part of a battlefield, all the carefully calculated, acceptable risks vanish, replaced by uncertainties no safety manual anticipated. Experts in nuclear law and security had warned for years that international rules were dangerously weak when it came to protecting nuclear facilities in war. There are conventions that say nuclear plants should not be attacked, and that states should avoid actions that risk radioactive releases across borders. Yet these rules were written assuming that any violator would fear global outrage and diplomatic isolation. Chernobyl and the occupied plants in Ukraine showed how fragile that assumption really is. In a large, brutal conflict, nuclear sites become bargaining chips, leverage points, places where one side assumes the other will be afraid to shoot. The moral calculus of never risk a release clashes with military logic. Once that line is crossed, no treaty text can put the genie back in the bottle. In the wake of the containment failure, proposals began circulating for much stronger global norms. Some argue that any attack on a nuclear facility or any military deployment that turns such a site into a de facto fortress should be treated like the use of chemical or biological weapons, not just a violation of rules, but an international crime. Others call for a special protected status, akin to demilitarized zones, where international inspectors and neutral peacekeepers would be stationed during conflicts to ensure plants are neither used nor targeted. The problem, as always, lies in enforcement. The same governments that might violate these rules are the ones that must agree to them and vote on them. Without a mechanism to intervene when a powerful country ignores the rules, new agreements risk becoming solemn pieces of paper that shatter the moment war breaks out. Even countries far from any current war have been quietly reevaluating their nuclear assumptions. Operators have asked, what happens if communications are cut for weeks? If cyber attacks disable monitoring systems while physical attacks threaten power lines? If supply chains break and replacement parts cannot arrive? Emergency plans that once focused on natural disasters and localized accidents now must consider scenarios where hostile forces intentionally cut off power, occupy the control room, or use drones to probe weak spots in the plant's physical defenses. For some nations, this has triggered renewed debates about whether expanding nuclear power is wise in a world of drones and hybrid warfare. For others, it has led to urgent investments in hardened backup systems, redundant monitoring networks, and more robust international cooperation. There is an even deeper lesson, more philosophical but no less important. For years, the story of Chernobyl's new safe confinement was told as proof that technology can undo, or at least neutralize, the mistakes of the past. Humans, it was said, had the ingenuity to build a structure that would lock their worst catastrophe away for 100 years, giving future generations time to develop even better solutions. The recent damage exposes the fragility of that faith. Technology is not deployed in a vacuum. It lives in a world shaped by politics, conflict, and human decisions that engineers cannot control. A perfect containment design on paper still depends on imperfect societies to protect it. The broken shield of Chernobyl teaches that there is no purely technical fix to fundamentally political problems, and that nuclear safety, in the end, is only as strong as humanity's willingness to avoid turning power plants and waste sites into weapons of war. Looking ahead, the fate of Chernobyl now branches into several possible futures, none of them simple and none of them entirely comforting. The first, best-case scenario begins with something that cannot be engineered, a reduction in violence. If the conflict de-escalates or reaches some form of ceasefire, international experts and Ukrainian authorities could regain stable access to the site. Under this scenario, engineers would carry out a comprehensive structural assessment of the damaged new safe confinement, design reinforcement or partial rebuilding of the damaged roof and support systems, and restore the ventilation and monitoring networks that once made the structure effective. The work would be dangerous, expensive, and slow, but not impossible. Over years or even decades, the arch could be stabilized to a point where controlled decommissioning inside it becomes feasible again. The original plan, to gradually dismantle the old sarcophagus, extract the most hazardous materials, and reduce the long-term risk, could resume, albeit delayed and far costlier than originally anticipated. In this optimistic trajectory, Chernobyl would still remain a contaminated, tightly controlled site for the rest of the century. The exclusion zone would not vanish, but its status might shift from active threat back toward managed legacy. The surrounding communities would receive some assurance that their children and grandchildren will not face escalating risks. The damaged arch will become a scar, a visible reminder that human conflict nearly turned a contained disaster back into an ongoing one, but also a symbol of recovery, of an international community that eventually stepped in to repair what war had broken. This scenario demands political will, stable funding, and a significant period without new attacks, all of which are uncertain. Yet remains the outcome many scientists, engineers, and residents quietly hope for. The second, more pessimistic, but disturbingly plausible scenario is one of muddling through. In this future, the war does not intensify to the point of total destruction at Chernobyl, but also does not end in a way that allows a full international engineering effort. Security remains fragile. Funding comes in fits and starts, and access is intermittent. Under these conditions, only minimal, patchwork repairs can be carried out. Temporary reinforcements to the most damaged sections, makeshift replacement of a few monitoring systems, quick fixes to ventilation where possible. The aim in this world is not to fully restore the original design, but simply to prevent rapid collapse. The structure becomes a kind of chronic patient kept alive by occasional interventions, always one unexpected shock away from serious deterioration. In such a muddling through scenario, Chernobyl turns into a long-term, unmanaged risk that everyone knows about but no one truly solves. Radiation releases might remain relatively small and sporadic, but they would be difficult to predict or track. Each storm, each harsh winter, each heat wave would raise questions. Did the damage get worse? Did something shift inside the ruined reactor? Governments and agencies would respond with periodic statements, limited data, and promises of future projects that never quite materialize. The exclusion zone will persist as a strange, half-forgotten wound on the map, absorbing attention only when something goes visibly wrong. This is in many ways the path of least resistance. No dramatic catastrophe, but no real closure either. The third, worst-case scenario is the one that keeps nuclear safety experts awake at night. In this future, either the war escalates again around Chernobyl or neglect allows the damaged structure to deteriorate unchecked. A new strike, a large explosion nearby, or progressive structural failure could cause major sections of the new safe confinement to collapse. If that collapse disrupts the already weakened old sarcophagus inside, large quantities of radioactive dust and debris could be released into the atmosphere. While this would likely not replicate the full scale of the 1986 explosion, it could still produce a significant new contamination plume, forcing fresh evacuations, contaminating land again, and sending yet another radioactive cloud across borders. The psychological impact alone, seeing images of destroyed indestructible shield, would be enormous. In the worst case, Chernobyl becomes a perpetual source of anxiety, a sight that periodically reminds the world of its presence whenever something cracks, falls, or releases a detectable burst of radiation. Efforts to build public trust in nuclear technology would suffer globally. Every debate about new reactors or waste suppositories would be overshadowed by images of a broken arch over a still smoldering past. For Ukraine and its neighbors, the consequences would be even harsher. More land lost, more livelihoods destroyed, more generations asked to accept invisible risks they did not choose. And all of it would underline a grim lesson. That even when humanity musters the resources to manage a disaster, those efforts can be undone not by nature or time, but by human violence. The story of Chernobyl's broken shield is still being written, and what happens next depends not just on engineers and politicians, but on all of us who care about the future of our planet. If this video opened your eyes to the fragile line between containment and catastrophe, between human achievement and human destruction, then share it with others who need to understand what's at stake. Hit that like button to help this message reach beyond borders, because nuclear safety is not a local issue. It's a global responsibility that affects every person breathing the same air, drinking from the same water cycle, and living under the same sky. Subscribe to this channel if you want to stay informed about stories the mainstream media often overlooks, the hidden crises, the forgotten disasters, and the uncomfortable truths about how our world really works. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update, because situations like Chernobyl can change rapidly, and the next development might be the one that truly matters. Leave a comment below telling us what you think. Should nuclear sites be granted absolute protection during wartime? Can technology ever truly solve problems that are fundamentally about human conflict? Your voice matters in this conversation. And if you found value in this deep dive, consider checking out our other videos where we explore the dark histories, true crimes, and hidden stories behind some of the world's most fascinating and dangerous places. Knowledge is power, but only if we choose to use it. The question now is, will we learn from Chernobyl before it's too late, or will we watch as history's warnings fade into forgotten lessons? That choice, ultimately, is ours to make. Thank you for watching, and remember, the truth is always worth seeking, no matter how uncomfortable it might be.